According to Pastor Jane, Dr. Lori Anne Ferrell is an long-time friend of Pastor Jane's, and also her Christian history professor. Formerly on the faculty of Claremont School of Theology, Lori Anne moved down the block a few years ago, and she's now part of the English faculty at the Claremont Graduate School. She's a specialist in the social and religious world of England of the 16th and 17th centuries, and now she flies to Britain a whole lot to edit the sermons of John Donne and enjoy white tea and driving on the wrong side of the road. In 2005, she curated a fabulous exhibit, The Bible and the People, at the Huntington Library and wrote a book by the same name, which led to her appearing on several TV specials about the Bible and its history. She's available for autographs following the worship, apparently. I don't know if there's a charge for that or not, but also, if you ask nightly, she might do a cartwheel or sing some of her favorite songs from South Park, the movie. Actually, Pastor Jane isn't sure about Lori Ann's current availability for cartwheeling or South Park singing. These are activities she and Pastor Jane have enjoyed doing, and together, in their earlier years when their backs and their memories were better. Now, as they say, it's in God's hands, if God has hands. Dr. Lori Anne Ferrell.
Not in this dress. In other words, I knew Pastor Jane when she was Ms. Voigt, and I was Professor Ferrell, and that state of affairs didn't last very long. Thank you so much for having me today. As you'll soon see, I am not a preacher or a worship leader, but it's fun to be invited to come and talk about some of the subjects that I have talked about for many years with Jane, and to come and meet all of you in this wonderful comedy church, a concept that is quite new, I think, to me, but not from listening to Jane over the years. I knew she was interested in comedy and theology, as you'll hear, but I had no idea that she'd actually be able to get somebody to go along with her. Great.
Welcome to our church.
Thank you. Yeah, the church for the rest of us. And I especially like that Pastor Jane advertised this post-Easter wrap-up season as one that would feature professional comedians and musicians, and then invited one of her old professors to come and talk to you. Really, Miss Voigt? Now, professors do an awful lot of stand-up, I suppose, but little of it provokes gales of laughter. Although if any of you in the audience actually are comedians, and I'm pretty sure now some of you are, we all do share one experience: flop sweat. Now here, all of you guys are good at what you do when you perform, so for you I suspect this happens like once a year, but for me, I test my arid extra dry twice a week in general. Now, as I was saying, from the time that she was a student, Jane talked about comedy, improv, and theology. And so we've bonded for life over a shared interest: theater. Namely, the theater of the Middle Ages that the scholars call the mystery or biblical plays. I can explain that quite quickly because you've already done it for us. And that is that a lot of the Bible is quite mysterious and difficult to manage. So you either do it like this, or you read it off the app, and taken out of context, or even sometimes in context, it's a little puzzling. So, Jane and I also bonded over, I think, a more scholarly and classical concept of theater. Subjects like, what is tragedy and what is comedy? And because this second question is a lot more boring, I'll do it first and get it out of the way. In scholarly terms, comedy doesn't exactly mean the delivery of fun, or jackanapes, or jokes, or humor. It means quite simply the staged opposite of stage tragedy. In shorthand, for all you Aristotelians out there, tragedy ends in death, or where a ghost and a prince meet, and everything ends in mincemeat. And comedy ends in marriage, or goes together like a horse and carriage. So you got the musician part. In other words, comedy ends at the beginning of something big. The world must be people, shouts Benedict in one of Shakespeare's greatest, if inaptly named comedies, Much Ado About Nothing. Shakespearean comedy isn't all that funny to today's students. I have to insist over and over to mind that The Merchant of Venice, Measure for Measure, and The Taming of the Shrew are comedies. Even though we wince through much of them, and this is not just because comedy doesn't always survive its time travel. Comedies simply, in classical terms, end in marriages, no matter what happens before. There are dreadful, awful bits in Much Ado About Nothing, including deaths, not all of which are faked, before we get to the marital didn't want. And there are also hilariously side-splitting bits in Hamlet, King Lear, and Macbeth, but few people walk out of those still humming the tunes. So the point of comedy is that in the end, love triumphs over star-crossed lovers, cross-dressed heroines, and over the deaths that turn out sometimes to have been faked. And that is a human approximation of the grace of God, and that is why Dante called his tour of hell and purgatory as well as heaven the Divine Comedy, and this is why you can have a comedy theology, and that is why this is such a cool church. Guess what, though? You didn't even have to go to school to know this, or even to be able to write as well as Jane, or even Shakespeare. People in the Middle Ages knew this intimately. They knew it in their very bones. And all they knew of the Bible, they knew, as my grandpa used to say, from the funny papers. The potted little stories their priest told them, mostly from what Christians called an Old Testament, which is a great joke in itself. Imagine the heavenly laughter at that presumption, as if all forced marriages proceeded on the basis of the younger partner going to the altar without the older partner's consent. Anyway, Genesis has the best bones for a comic sketch I can think of. It is just so humane. And actually, I had no idea that you would have already proven that today, so I didn't even have to really show up. But let's just say the literacy rates in medieval England were only slightly better than that of an average teenager today. But medievals knew their Bible stories. And once a year, throughout the Middle Ages, they got to act them out in the streets of England on the holiday called Corpus Christi. Now, this holiday was meant to celebrate the church's establishment of the sacrament of communion, but in fact was, as all of you who have shivered through a summer in England can attest, a celebration of the first night you could stay out without wearing an entire sheep's worth of wool, or perhaps just an entire sheep if you were sloppy about it. Now, medieval guilds, sort of like trades unions, but with much grander names like the Worshipful Company of Mercers, or the Water Leaders and Drawers of the River Dee, worked tirelessly for a full year every year to put on a show. They decorated things called pageant wagons, sort of like the way the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade has become since Broadway took it over. These wagons would be set up as stages. They would be moving along a route. The players would then stop the wagon, convert the wagon to a stage, jump out sumptuously dressed from clothes that they borrowed and stole, and act out stories from the Bible, in their own words, so to speak. And so in the beginning, as they say, these were probably transmitted mostly via oral tradition, and yes, a good deal of quite bawdy improvisation. We only actually have their scripts now, and you can see at least 2 copies of scripts of these at the Huntington Library, where I do an awful lot of my research. But we only have them now because as the newly Protestantized church of the 16th and 17th century began suppressing these street scenes in the 16th century, some very wise people took the time to scribble down the stories for posterity's sake. Now, before we all get mad at the Protestant church, which I believe we're still sitting in, even if it is a comedy church, don't be too sad. The Protestants were probably mostly worried about public drunkenness. Okay, you can be sad. But they were mostly worried about these street scenes in themselves. And besides, this freed up all those people standing in the streets to run down to the Globe to see Shakespeare. But here's the fun comedy part, which I think you were probably hoping I would get to sooner. Like people in the Middle Ages felt no particular compunction, unlike the rest of you this morning, to stick to a script they couldn't read anyway, or even understand, as most of the Bible was only in Latin at that time. Therefore, they felt just fine in the 14th and 15th centuries, and they felt not at all blasphemous about filling in aspects of plot and character they felt should have been in the story, but somehow got left out when Jerome was all writing this down for the Roman Catholic Church in the 4th century. Now, these details invariably disclose what we might call the common observation aspect of daily life. Somehow the Bible did not always include these, or probably better said, its brand of comedy just didn't always travel well. Also, there was a distressing lack in the biblical script, judging by the way the medievals tried to address this gap, of what we might call the woman's point of view, and even more neglectful, the kid's point of view. And medieval players added these big time. So everything I'm going to tell you now, believe it or not, is coming from a 15th century script. And my favorite example, actually one of my favorite examples is Noah's Ark, which you guys did so beautifully that I would hate to actually gild that lily because it would not be possible. So I'll give you a different favorite example. It's from the mystery biblical plays at Chester, which is a nice, boring market town on the River Dee, whose population swelled to 40 times its usual weight on Corpus Christi because, and this means that merchants loved these holidays. People had thronged year to year to see the famous Chester mysteries played in the streets. Now, one of the ones that I like the best, and one is actually you've got over here in this fancy window, is Abraham and Isaac, which was played every single year, I am not making this up, by the Butchers Guild, for reasons that must be all too apparent. Because nobody was above a bit of savvy advertising on Corpus Christi with 40 times the people that were usually in town might be around. I wonder whether there's a good butcher around here. They seem to do kids really well. Anyway, just like in the Bible, in the Chester play, yes, God tells Abraham to take his son and kill him. Kids, I'm really glad they're off in Sunday school right now. Abraham, in a wonderful, typical show of what I think of as male-on-male, unquestioning obedience, kind of like that put-me-in-coach attitude to life, starts trudging off to do exactly that. But the scene on the makeshift altar stone soon degenerates into misfire, like a Laurel and Hardy routine. 3 times Abraham attempts to do this deed, only to be interrupted by his son Isaac, who is actually giving us a bravura display of tactical maneuvering, which must be actually rather familiar to all of us, whose kids stop us every time we try to get to the door to ask for another drink of water or a story at bedtime. So in the Chester play of Noah, circa 15th century, Abraham raises his fatal hand. Wait, Father! Can you please turn me face down, which means your thing has got it wrong over there. I don't want to have to see this coming. Abraham does what he says, turns him upside down, raises his hand again. We have stage directions. Wait, Father! Could you blindfold me? Now, why this is, because he's looking at the stone, I don't know. He does that. Tension is now raising to an almost impossible height. And in the one that never fails to make me first gasp and then giggle on the 3rd try, Abraham raises his hand the 3rd time, and he says, okay, Father, do what you have to do, but boy, just wait till you get home and Mom hears about this. Now, I am only paraphrasing a little. The actual line is more like, tell you not, my mother, what you did. But you get the point. Isaac's brilliant delaying tactics now give God some time to show up and save the day, with the ram and all. But I think we're also meant to appreciate the human truth that no mom would sacrifice her son just because somebody, calling himself God, told her to. She'd demand to see some identification first. She'd then say something like, if anybody's going to kill this kid, it's going to be me. Have you seen his room? And she would have trained her kid how to avoid strangers. Or in this case, handle people who have suddenly and inexplicably become strangers. So best and last, and best of all, we are meant to applaud this plucky kid and his saving sense of comic timing. I expect what we learn of comedy in these embellishments on the scripture is that the best laugh comes when we wait just long enough for it. Rush it, and the payoff is thin. Wait too long, and whoa, you're in the wrong play. The comic scene in Hamlet is long over, and everything is about to end in mincemeat. But you see, lay people in the 14th and 15th century wove their own stories in and out of the ones they had been given in Scripture, using the script of the Bible to write a theology all their own, one that expressed what they knew instinctively, that their God understood how their communities and people really worked, and no more expected them to look like the year 2013 BC or 113 AD than, say, 2013 AD. These people were partying like it was 1499, and we have proof that it was a boffo smash hit. There's another manuscript in the British Library that quotes an English priest of that period commending the Chester plays to his parishioners in 1499. If you want to know the Bible, he apparently said, go to Chester, and there you can see it all played. So he would applaud you, you members of LA's Comedy Church. He knew, and we know, that theological comedy is not about cheap laughs. Okay, we know it's not always about you. But often the laughs and those insights they bring, like guided delivery systems, are both expansive and expensive, but can be dearly, dearly bought. Take an unwritten page from the Middle Ages, mixed with a written page from time immemorial, and wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. Now deliver the punchline, and now, oh snap! The last laugh was yet to come. I think in the world of even the fanciest scholarly theologies, that's still called grace. The curtain falls, the show begins. Thanks very much.